Well, good evening, everybody. How are you guys doing? Good, good. Well, let me get things set up here. That old expression, there's no place like home. Yep, well, for me, this is a homecoming. If there's ever a place in this world that I would call home, it would be West Virginia. Now, I wasn't born here. I was born in Ames, Iowa, in the Midwest, but when I was 4 years old, my family moved to Montgomery, West Virginia. My dad was hired to be the chairman of the physics department at WVIT. So the campus of WVIT was my playground. And when I was in sixth grade, my family moved to Spencer, to Roane County, and I spent my junior high and high school years in Roane County. And then I moved with my family to Polka, which is where I graduated from high school. Hence, the label of a polka dot, right? I went to West Virginia State College, and that's where I met my wife. That's where I got a BS degree in chemistry. And after finishing up my undergraduate degree, I left West Virginia. I went to Ohio University for graduate school and then began my career. And I wound up 18 years ago in Southern California, outside of Los Angeles, when I joined a ministry called Reasons to Believe. Now, you might find this hard to believe, but Los Angeles is very different than West Virginia. The traffic is horrendous. The congestion is unbelievable. I live about 15 miles from the office, and it takes me an hour to go to and from my office because of the traffic. It's really, really bad. But the climate is unbelievable. It's beautiful climate year-round. The cultural diversity is amazing. It's a wonderful, wonderful place to live in many, many ways. And for some people, one of the best features of living in Southern California is that you are 3 hours by car away from Las Vegas. There are friends that I have that at a drop of a hat will go up to Las Vegas to see a show, to do a little gambling. I don't know, have any of you in here been to Las Vegas? Yeah, a few of you. Now, I don't like Las Vegas at all. I have to go there quite a bit for a number of reasons. And for whatever reason, I just detest the city of Las Vegas. As soon as I hit the city limits, it's like the life has been sucked out of my soul. And I don't know why that is, but I just don't like to be there. And I'm not sure, again, the reason for that, but I suspect in part it's because it troubles me that the whole economy is built around gambling and entertainment. Not that there's anything inherently wrong with those two things, but in Las Vegas it's carried to an extreme, and in fact, it's really a city built around fantasy and illusions and false promises. And if you are in Las Vegas and you cannot distinguish between fact and fantasy, between illusion and reality, between a genuine promise and a false promise, you can wind up in a world of hurt. And unfortunately, I get to see from time to time the underbelly of the city of Las Vegas and what that city can actually do to people who, again, make poor decisions. And in a sense, Las Vegas is a wonderful metaphor, an apt metaphor for the theory of biological evolution. Because in my experience, if Christians don't know how to think about biological evolution, they can wind up in a world of hurt. Because when it comes to the theory of evolution, it is both fact and fiction, fact and fantasy. And if you can't distinguish between fact and fantasy, again, you can wind up in big trouble. In fact, if you look at surveys done by Barna, you will learn that one of the reasons why young people walk away from their faith when they go to college is because of science issues. And if you drill down and you look at the specific concerns, they almost all of them have to do with biological evolution in one way, shape, or form. And so what I want to do tonight is talk to you about how to think about biological evolution. Tomorrow morning and tomorrow evening, we'll talk about scientific evidence for God's existence and the reliability of the Bible. But tonight, to kick things off, what I want to do is spend some time giving you some pointers, some insights as to how to think about biological evolution, because if there is, again, an area that causes Christians trouble when it comes to science faith issues, it is the theory of evolution. And there are 4 key points that I want you to keep in mind this evening. The first key point is that definitions are important. That when we talk about evolution, that term can mean a number of different things. And if you don't know what that term means, you can again wind up being rather confused and have a hard time processing information that's coming your way with regard to the theory of evolution. Also, philosophy is very important. Evolution is not only a scientific theory, it's a philosophical system. And if you can't recognize the difference between where the science ends and the philosophy begins, again, you can wind up in trouble. You need to also recognize that there are very real scientific challenges to the theory of evolution, and it's important to be able to identify and articulate those. And then finally, it's also important to recognize that the way in which you interpret the data also depends on a worldview, and that the evidence that many people will point to as evidence for evolution could be readily explained and accommodated within a creation model perspective. So these are the 4 key points. If you can remember these 4 key points, you're going to be rather adept at engaging the theory of evolution in a way that will not challenge your faith, but actually affirm your faith as a Christian. What I'd like to do tonight as we look at these 4 points is to pose a series of questions and then answer those questions. These are questions that I oftentimes will hear from people when it comes to the theory of evolution. So I'm going to pose these questions and answer them, and as I do so, again, keep these 4 points in mind. Okay, the first question is, what is evolution? And specifically what we want to do here in the next few minutes is not only describe what the theory of evolution is, but also help you to understand how the theory of evolution functions in the life sciences. Because in effect, it's the grand unifying theory for biology, and you have to appreciate why that is the case and how it functions. Now, the theory of evolution is attributed to Charles Darwin, because Darwin, of course, wrote the book Origins of Species, but he discovered the mechanism by which evolutionary changes take place. Actually, Darwin was not the only person to make this discovery. Alfred Russel Wallace was the co-discoverer of a process called natural selection. But this is essentially what Darwin proposed, and this idea is at the core of evolutionary theory even today. And in this cartoon, you see this herd of deer, and some have dark coats and some have light coats, and for whatever reason, those with a dark coat are much more likely to survive than those with a light coat. And because they're more likely to survive, they're going to have more offspring, and because they have more offspring from generation to generation over time, that species will transform from a mixture of light coats and dark coats to one that's predominantly dark coated. This is called natural selection. Natural selection operating on heritable genetic variation. And over time, there can be transformations that take place in a species. This is essentially what Darwin discovered and what Darwin proposed. Now, when Darwin discovered this and made this proposal for how evolution works, what he was really trying to do was address the question that was called the mystery of mysteries in his day, namely, how do species originate? And so Darwin proposed, again, this idea of natural selection. Sometimes it's called his special theory of evolution. It's just simply a theory for how species originate. But Darwin wasn't satisfied. What he wanted to do was to take this mechanism and make a grand claim that this mechanism could explain everything that we see in biology. That if this mechanism worked over vast periods of time, according to Darwin and to biologists today, it could actually account for large-scale biological changes. Darwin also argued that this mechanism could explain the diversity of life that we see on the planet today. It could explain the diversity of life throughout Earth's history, and It could even explain what's called biogeographical distribution, just simply where animals and plants and other organisms are located, their location throughout the world. Also, Darwin claimed that this mechanism could account for the exquisite adaptation that organisms show for their environment and the appearance of design in biology. Prior to this time, biologists viewed biological systems as the product of a creator, as the work of a mind. That was a common way to view biological systems prior to the mid-1800s. When Darwin proposed his theory, he supplanted a creator with a mechanism, saying that the appearance of design was not evidence for God's handiwork, but was the outworking of evolutionary mechanisms. His theory basically took biology from the realm of design to the realm of mechanism. This is why it's called the Darwinian Revolution, because he fundamentally changed the way people viewed biological systems. In fact, these ideas are so important now in modern-day biology, this grand claim that evolution can explain everything, that you have geneticists or scientists like the famous geneticist Theodosius Dobzhansky writing that nothing in biology makes sense except in light of the theory of evolution. Have any of you ever heard that statement before? It's a very commonly quoted statement. And again, this is expressing the idea that evolution is the organizing principle in biology. But you also have people like Richard Dawkins going one step further, making these kind of claims that if it is absolutely safe to say that if you meet somebody who claims not to believe in evolution, that person is ignorant, stupid, or insane, or wicked, but I'd rather not consider that. Those are almost fighting words. But what Dawkins is basically saying is, look, the theory of evolution is the organizing principle in biology. It is so well established that if you meet somebody who says they don't believe in evolution, they just simply are unaware of the facts. They're ignorant, or they're stupid. They can't understand the theory of evolution, or they are insane. They've got mental issues. Or they're wicked, and that's basically taking a jab at creationist and intelligent design proponents when he's saying that. But again, this is telling us that the theory of evolution is this prominent idea in biology. It's biology's organizing principle. So this is not something you're going to be able to sidestep or escape if you're a Christian. You've got to take it on. You've got to take it head on. And of course, then the question becomes, why is evolution so troubling? And I think as a Christian, you begin to get the idea why it's so troubling, because what you're claiming with the theory of evolution is that everything that we see in biology is ultimately explicable through mechanism alone. And if it's explicable through mechanism alone, then you don't need a creator. What role does the creator play? And of course, it's in complete contradiction, it's in complete contrast to what the Bible tells us, that God is the creator of life, He's the sustainer of life, He's the one who has directed and orchestrated the history of life for His purposes. It's hard to maintain that viewpoint and at the same time argue that everything that we see in biology is the work of evolutionary mechanisms. More troubling is also the idea that it essentially undermines the position of humanity in the creation, that instead of being viewed as image bearers, the crown of creation made in God's image with a purpose, what evolution does is render human beings with a complete lack of meaning and purpose. We are not the crown of creation. We are just one of countless number of species. There's nothing really special about us, according to the evolutionary paradigm. And of course, that again strikes at the very heart of how Christianity views human beings, because if we're not made in God's image, if we don't have meaning or purpose, then how do we, again, make sense of what Scripture teaches us, where human beings have a very high purpose, namely to be in a relationship with our Creator because we bear God's image? So the theory of evolution is again, deeply problematic. And in fact, when I was a student at West Virginia State College, my biology professors basically taught these very ideas. These are ideas that I was confronted with in the science classroom. In fact, you even have people, again, like Richard Dawkins, who say that the theory of evolution makes it possible to be an intellectually satisfied atheist. That is, the metaphysical implications of the theory of evolution naturally support an atheistic worldview. Now, there are, in light of this, Christians who are suggesting that maybe God could have used evolution as the way to create. This is becoming a view that's very prominent among evangelical Christians. This view is called evolutionary creationism or theistic evolution. And the idea here is, yes, indeed, evolution is a fact according to this perspective, but evolution could just simply be the mode or the means that God used to create. Well, I appreciate very much what these Christians are trying to do when they propose this idea. They're trying to redeem the evolutionary process. But the fact of the matter is, I find this, again, to be a little bit hard to reconcile with what Scripture teaches. Because if you take this view, then human beings are the product of an evolutionary process. And if that's the case, there cannot be a historical Adam and Eve from which all humanity emanates. Either Adam and Eve have to be mythical, or Adam and Eve have to be representatives, but there are other human beings around at the same time with Adam and Eve, and I have a very difficult time squaring that with what you see in Genesis 2, as well as other places throughout Scripture. It seems to me that the Bible is teaching that Adam and Eve were real individuals that gave rise to all humanity. So I don't think this particular approach excuse me, is very effective. Moreover, it opens up all kinds of theological concerns relating to things like biblical inerrancy. What do we mean when we talk about human beings made in God's image? It raises questions about what do you mean regarding the fall. Was the fall real? What is original sin? How does sin infect all of humanity? It even has implications for the atonement. So this is not a way, in my view, to address the theory of evolution as a Christian. We've got to do something different. We have to take a different approach. Excuse me. Okay, now, a lot of times I'm asked this question, and that is, isn't evolution really a religion? Isn't really evolution just based on faith? And I understand why people ask those questions, and in my view, the answer to those questions is no. But evolution is as much a philosophy as it is a scientific idea. And this is a very, very important point that I want you to try the best you can to grasp. Because if you walk away with nothing else, then this idea, this evening, your evening will be well spent. Now, how many of you have heard of the idea of philosophical naturalism? You may not have heard that term before, but you're familiar with it. It's basically atheism. Philosophical naturalism is a philosophical position that there is no God. There is no supernatural. All that exists is the physical material world. Sorry, excuse me. As the late Carl Sagan said, the universe is all that there was, is, and ever will be. This view is sometimes called, again, atheism, naturalism, materialism. It's a philosophical position. Now, there's a related concept that is derived from philosophical naturalism called methodological naturalism. And this is the philosophical framework that undergirds contemporary science. And as the name implies, golly, sorry about that. This topic has got me all choked up. As the name implies, with methodological naturalism, it is this idea that when you engage in the scientific enterprise, you have to function, methodologically speaking, as if you were an atheist. In other words, whether you believe in God or not, when you engage in science, You set aside that belief in God, and you function as if God doesn't exist. You look for only material explanations for the universe and phenomena in the universe. You look only for mechanistic, natural process explanations. You cannot appeal to supernatural explanations. You cannot appeal to the role of a creator to account for any feature in nature. That is simply off the table. The only thing you can do is, again, look to explain things through mechanism. You are methodologically a naturalist. You're methodologically an atheist. Sometimes this is called benchtop atheism or provisional atheism. And as you can imagine, this now has some very interesting and troubling consequences. Namely, that if you take this view, the only way you can explain the origin, the history, and the design of life is through evolutionary mechanisms. That's the only option. There has to be some form of evolution that accounts for biology, by definition, because you've eliminated the other option that a creator might play a role in the origin and the design of life. So whether or not the data supports the theory of evolution, it can't be falsified. Excuse me, because there is no other option. Does that make sense to you? And so evolution is true by default. It's true because you philosophically have predetermined it to be true. And you'll see how this plays out as we talk about this about how to think about evolution throughout the course of the evening. Just so you can appreciate how deeply entrenched this idea is in the life sciences, I want you to read with me this quote from Richard Lewontin, a biologist at Harvard University. He says this: "We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of its failure to fulfill many of its extravagant promises of health and life, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just so stories, because we have a prior commitment, a commitment to materialism. It is not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept the material explanation of the phenomenal world, but on the contrary, that we are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, that materialism is an absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door." So basically what, again, Lewontin is saying here is this, that basically no matter what the data says, no matter how ludicrous the idea, as long as you're not appealing to a creator, that idea can remain within the construct of science, even if it doesn't have data and evidence supporting it. But as soon as you introduce the idea that maybe God did it, that is considered a priori out of bounds. So evolution is true by default. It's true because of philosophical pre-commitments. It's philosophical commitments that basically are propping up the theory of evolution in many respects. And you're going to see that to be the case as we go through some of the scientific challenges to the theory of evolution. Now, what about this, though? If evolution is the prevailing scientific view of origins, don't we have to accept it? I hear a lot of Christians basically asking this question and answering this question, yes. And of course, the concern is that we're going to be walking, we're no longer going to be walking in lockstep with our culture if we reject the theory of evolution. We're not going to appear to be scientifically credible if we reject the theory of evolution. That's the concern that undergirds this question. And what I want to show you in the next few minutes is that just because it's the prevailing scientific view doesn't mean that we have to accept it, because there are scientific challenges to the theory of evolution that are legitimate challenges. But also I want to point out that there are aspects of the theory of evolution that we can indeed embrace as evangelical Christians. That evolution is both fact and fantasy. It is both illusion and reality. And so what we need to do is be able to identify what aspects of the theory are factual, what aspects of the theory are well evidenced, what aspects of the theory are reality, and distinguish that from those aspects that are fantasy, that are illusionary. And to do that, we need to think about, what does evolution mean? Now, in a broad sense, it just simply means change with time. But when we apply this idea of change with time to biological systems, what we see is that there are different ways in which biological systems can change. And there are three forms of evolution: microevolution, speciation, and microbial evolution, the evolution of bacteria and single-celled organisms and things like viruses, that are well evidenced, that you could argue are a fact. And what we'll see in a few minutes is that these particular forms of evolution don't pose any kind of real challenge to the role of God as creator. In fact, you could even see these forms of evolution as part of God's design for the natural world, as part of his providence. But then there's other forms of evolution that are actually problematic. Macroevolution and chemical evolution are the origin of life. And these forms of evolution actually have scientific issues associated with them. They are not well evidenced. And so, by being able to distinguish what the term evolution actually means can go a long way for us in terms of how we think about evolution and how we engage the scientific community on these issues. Now, what is microevolution? It's adaptation, basically. It's variation within a species. The textbook example are the peppered moths. How many of you remember the peppered moths, right? You know, these are, in the UK, these moths underwent a transformation from a white-winged variety to a dark-winged variety as the pollution in the environment increased, and then reversed back to a white-winged variety when the pollution was cleaned up in the environment. This is an example of microevolution, probably driven by natural selection. There's still a peppered moth. The only thing that's happened is it's changed its wing color. Okay, there's nothing dramatic happening here, other than this organism is able to adapt to its environment in order that it can survive. Speciation is essentially one species giving rise to a closely related sister species. It's merely an extension of microevolution, where there is some type of isolation within the population, allowing microevolution to work differently in distinct populations, and as a result generating distinct species as a result of that process happening over a significant period of time. The textbook example would be the Galapagos finches. Presumably an ancestral finch made its way to the Galapagos Islands, and then they diversify into a variety of different variety of different finches that differ in body size and beak shape, in beak size, but there's nothing dramatic happening here, other than, again, these ancestral populations kind of breaking up into subspecies and maybe into true species. Again, there's nothing dramatic happening. There's no fundamental change in design. There still are finches. Another example that you might be familiar with is the horse series. How many of you have seen the horse series in biology textbooks? Maybe a few of you. And the idea here is that over the span of about 50 million years, you have the ancestral horse, which is about the size of a large dog, with a foot structure that has toes, over time undergoing basically a change in size to the size of horses today. And the foot structure is altered to go from one with toes to one with hooves. That's not a very dramatic change that happens over the span of 50 million years. It's a rather trivial, minor change. You could just simply see this as an example of speciation. There's nothing, again, that undermines the idea of God as creator when you look at something like that. And again, it's interesting because occasionally there are horses that are born today that will actually have toes. It's called polydactyly in horses. And it happens from time to time. And again, it just simply shows how minimal the change actually is to go from a toe structure to one with a hoof. But again, an example of microevolution or speciation. And the way I look at microevolution and speciation is that it's a very elaborate, elegant feedback regulatory system. And feedback regulation is a pretty sophisticated designed system. It's a pretty sophisticated system. And to illustrate that is a thermostat, right? You know, that thing that men turn down and women turn up, right? Well, the thermostat has a thermocouple in it that measures the temperature of the room. And if the temperature deviates from the setting, then the heating system comes on or goes off, or the cooling system comes on or goes off. That's feedback regulation. It allows the system to remain in a state of a constant temperature, even though the environment is changing around it. And it's again through this feedback regulation. Well, that's the way I look at microevolution and speciation, is that it's essentially a mechanism that I think God introduces into the creation to give species robustness so that they can survive as the world that they live in is constantly undergoing change. I see that as part of God's providence. And so these are three areas of evolution that, again, are well evidenced: microevolution, speciation, and microbial evolution. And most of the evidence that you see for evolution actually falls in this category. Now, this idea of microevolution is actually a very valuable tool in our toolkit as Christians, because it can help us to explain things like, where does racial diversity come from? This is a question I'm asked all the time. Where do the races come from? And of course, Christians are troubled by this because in the Genesis 10 creation, or in Genesis 10, we see people being scattered around the world. And presumably, everybody was the same at that point in time. And so racial diversity would have had to arise very rapidly over a very short period of time. And for many Christians, that seems to be incompatible with what the biblical text says. How could that happen? Well, there's been work done recently on the origin of racial diversity, and we now understand that microevolution can produce racial diversity in very short order through a process of natural selection, sexual selection, something called genetic drift. And by the way, that picture there is a picture of natural selection in operation. You've got these three guys drinking beer in a pool with an electrical grill that's plugged into an extension cord, a power strip, floating on a couple of flip-flops. So if you want to know what natural selection looks like, that's exactly what it looks like. Now, but because of natural selection, we can explain things like differences in skin color. I'm not going to get into the details, but I believe the scientific evidence is indicating to us that the very first humans probably looked very much like African people groups look today. And of course, the very first humans would have lived very close to the equator. Well, in that environment where there's high levels of sunlight, having dark skin, having heavily pigmented skin is an advantage. Why? Because it prevents sunburn, it prevents things like skin cancer. More importantly, it helps to prevent the destruction or the loss of folic acid, which is very, very critical for a healthy pregnancy. But as you move from the equator to northern latitudes where there's less sunlight, having heavily pigmented skin is a disadvantage because it slows down the rate of vitamin D synthesis. The last step in vitamin D synthesis takes place when UV radiation from the sun impinges the skin, catalyzing chemical reactions in your skin that produce the final product in vitamin D, in the vitamin D pathway. In northern latitudes, if you have lighter skin, that actually becomes an advantage. It allows for effective vitamin D synthesis. Also, natural selection will force people in northern latitudes to have shorter, squat, more compact bodies because it helps to retain heat. Near the equator, long, elongated bodies are an advantage because they allow for effective heat radiation away from the body. Nose shape is also influenced by natural selection. Long noses are an advantage in northern latitudes because it allows the air to warm up before it actually goes into the lungs. So when the temperatures are cold, having a long nose is an advantage. So just simply by looking at natural selection, we can very quickly explain why people around the world look different and how this could arise very quickly. Also, there's something called sexual selection, which is the counterpart to natural selection. If natural selection is survival of the fittest, sexual selection would be survival of the most attractive. And different people around the world just simply view different features as being attractive. And those features actually turn out to be hair color, eye color, skin color, and certain facial features. Biologists call these signaling traits. And so from time to time, I'll tell my wife, hey, I really like your signaling traits. She somehow doesn't see that as a compliment, though. But anyway, the whole point is that natural selection and sexual selection operating at a microevolutionary level can basically explain where racial diversity comes from. And it can explain how it could emerge very rapidly in very short order in a way that's consistent with the biblical text. So this question is no longer a problem, again, because of the way in which we can explain it through these evolutionary processes. The idea that bacteria acquire antibiotic resistance, again, no big deal. This is, again, an example of evolution in action, but these are still the same species of bacteria. They just simply have acquired the resistance to antibiotics, and usually that resistance actually is not the evolution of a trait, but actually the destruction of certain biochemical processes that happen to be the target of the antibiotic. It's sometimes called a burnt bridge mutation because the cell is actually disabling part of its metabolism in order to avoid the effects of the antibiotic. But again, this is not something that's troubling to the Christian faith. On the other hand, chemical evolution or the origin of life or abiogenesis are, because here the claim is that molecules can self-organize into the very first cell. Here you're attributing creative potential to the evolutionary process. And by the way, we'll see in a few minutes, this is one of the places where the evolutionary paradigm faces some of the most significant challenges. Another place where I think the theory of evolution could be viewed as problematic to the Christian faith is with respect to macroevolution, where evolution now is claimed to have the capacity to generate large-scale biological changes, to transform one design into another design. And again, that would be something that I would see as a Christian as something that a creator would do, is to instantiate new biological designs in the created order. But again, this is also an area where we see some really significant scientific problems. But what you want to be careful now, that you know that there are these different types of evolution, you want to be careful about the shell game of evolution. Again, about this idea of not being able to distinguish between fact and fantasy, between illusion and reality, and nothing, again, exemplifies that more than the shell game, right? Because what you'll see happen oftentimes is that people who are arguing for the theory of evolution will say, well, bacteria evolve antibiotic resistance. We know that's true. Evolution is a fact, right? Have you ever heard that? Which then means that humans must have evolved from apes. I see that line of reasoning all the time. Do you see what's going on there? Scientists are using one definition of evolution that's well evidenced and then arguing on that basis that another type of evolution, it must be true as well, even though they don't produce evidence for that. So beware of the shell game. And let me show you an example of where that plays out. And that has to do with human origins. There is evidence that human beings are evolving, and people will then say, therefore, human beings must have evolved. And an example of human evolution, in addition to the origin of racial diversity, is something called lactase persistence. If you are in here this evening and you are lactose intolerant, you actually are more genetically pristine than people who can can digest milk sugars. So people that can digest milk sugar, you are basically mutants. Okay, lactase is the enzyme that breaks down lactose, which is milk sugar. And the first 2 years of life, normatively, you produce lactase because you're consuming milk in the first 2 years of your life. But by the time the baby begins to wean from its mother, the enzyme lactase is no longer needed, and so therefore is no longer produced. That's how things should normally work. But what happened is that when humans began to domesticate animals, there were some humans that experienced a mutation that allowed the lactase enzyme to be produced into adulthood, and because of that, they could basically consume animal milk. And that turned out to be an advantage. All right, so lactase persistence is an example of microevolution, and you can even see that as, again, an example of God's providence. But I can't tell you how many times I've heard people make this claim that because humans can evolve, we must have evolved. You see what's going on? It's the shell game, right? It's the shell game that's being played. The fact that humans have evolved this capacity to digest milk sugar is an example of microevolution. It's not evidence for human evolution from an ape-like creature. So again, be careful of the shell game. Okay, now, are there any scientific challenges to evolution? Well, the answer is yes. There's some very real and significant challenges to the theory of evolution. And two of them have to do with the origin of life and the origin of body plans. That's what we're going to focus on this evening. I'm not going to talk about the origin of human uniqueness. We'll touch on that tomorrow morning in the first message tomorrow morning. The origin of life, of course, is this idea that we mentioned already, that life emerges out of a prebiotic soup, out of a primordial soup, where you have chemicals on the early earth self-organizing into the very first cells. But the fact of the matter is, nobody knows how this would have happened. Every explanation for how this could have happened basically has led to a dead end, has resulted in a failed explanation. We simply do not know how to explain the origin of life. In fact, one of the world's leading experts in the origin of life when he was alive, a guy by the name of Leslie Orgel, basically made this statement with regard to one approach to the origin of life, that it would be a miracle, he said, if a strand of RNA ever appeared on the primitive Earth. I actually heard Leslie Orgel say that at an Origin of Life conference. In 2002, Hugh Ross and I went to an Origin of Life conference in Oaxaca, Mexico. This conference attracts the major Origin of Life researchers from around the world. Almost all of them are atheists. And Orgel, who was, again, the preeminent Origin of Life researcher of the world, was given the honor of opening up the conference with the first plenary lecture. And he summarized the status of something called the RNA world hypothesis, which is considered the leading explanation for how life would have originated. And after he went through problem after problem after problem, he stopped and he said these very words. But before he said this, he said something interesting. He said, "I hope there are no creationists in the audience, but it would be a miracle if a strand of RNA ever appeared on the primitive Earth." Elsewhere, he said this with regard to metabolism first scenarios. They require an appeal to magic, a series of remarkable coincidences, a near miracle. Here you have an atheist, a leading origin of life researcher, basically saying, for all intents and purposes, the origin of life appears to be miraculous, that there's no way to explain this through evolutionary means. This is a real problem, okay, if you're embracing the evolutionary paradigm. But this is interesting. Look at what astrobiologist and physicist Paul Davies says in his book on the origin of life. Although biogenesis strikes many as virtually miraculous, the starting point of any scientific investigation must be the assumption that life emerged naturally. Do you see the influence of methodological naturalism in that statement? This is why I would argue that the evolutionary paradigm is not falsifiable, because no matter what you throw at it, no matter how much it fails, it can't be abandoned because of the commitment to methodological naturalism. And so even though the evidence actually points to a creator being involved in the origin of life, the scientific community will never go down that path because, again, of the influence of methodological naturalism. Okay, another problem relates to the Cambrian explosion. This is an event in life's history where somewhere between 50 to 80% of the animal phyla that have ever appeared show up explosively in a very narrow window of time, in a geological instant. And this has no explanation from an evolutionary standpoint. Tomorrow morning we'll talk a little bit more about the Cambrian explosion and how I see it as providing powerful affirmation of the Genesis 1 creation account. But for tonight, I just want to focus on this as being a problem for the evolutionary paradigm. This is a statement that was found in a book by Doug Irwin and Jim Valentine. These are two of the world's leading experts on the Cambrian explosion. And what they basically say in their graduate level, this is a graduate level textbook. One important concern has been whether microevolutionary patterns commonly studied in modern organisms by evolutionary biologists are sufficient to understand and explain the events of the Cambrian, or whether evolutionary theory needs to be expanded to include a more diverse set of macroevolutionary processes. We strongly hold to the latter position. The move from micro to macro forms a discontinuity. Do you see what's going on here based on some of the things that we've already discussed this evening? They basically are distinguishing between microevolution and macroevolution. And they basically are saying the same thing I just told you. That evidence for microevolution is evidence for microevolution. And these evolutionary biologists are admitting that we cannot take those mechanisms and use them to explain the Cambrian explosion. That the theory of evolution lacks that explanatory capacity. And what they're arguing is we somehow have to expand or add to or redevelop the theory of evolution to explain the Cambrian explosion. So again, you see that it's very important to be able to recognize what definition is being used when the term evolution is being used, what is the scale of the process, and what is the evidence at hand. But clearly you see that when it comes to macroevolution, the theory breaks down, at least with respect to the Cambrian explosion. In fact, we could spend an entire night going through all the different scientific issues with the theory of evolution. What I like about these two challenges is these are two places where you can find evolutionary biologists readily admitting we don't have an explanation. So you can basically show evolutionary biologists consistently agreeing that there's no explanation for the origin of life in the Cambrian explosion. Okay, now, is there scientific evidence for evolution? Well, if you ask an evolutionary biologist that question, they would say yes. It's the fossil record and its homologies. And we'll explain what homologies are in a minute. But I would actually argue that these two areas of evidence, these two arenas of evidence, these two categories of evidence, can actually be just as readily explained from a creation model standpoint. I mean, many people would point to the fossil record and they would say, look, here we have a fossil record that's showing different life forms at different different times in Earth's history. Very clearly, this is evidence that life has evolved, that there's an evolutionary history to life. I hear this all the time. But the fact of the matter is, we could also look at the fossil record and say, well, couldn't we just understand this as evidence that God created different life forms at different times in Earth's history for his purposes? That's just as valid an explanation. And in fact, prior to Darwin, the scientist Louis Agassiz, who was a creationist, viewed the fossil record in that way. So that view is actually part of the history of biology. And in fact, if you look at the Genesis 1 creation account, there are different days of creation. And God's doing different things on those different days of creation. There's a progressive flow to the creation account. There's a purposeful progression to what God does as creator. So you could understand, again, the fossil record from a creation model perspective. Moreover, when you look at the features of the fossil record, those features don't match what you would expect from an evolutionary standpoint. Instead, it looks as if these features are actually indicating God's involvement. Because when innovation happens in the history of life, it happens explosively, suddenly, instantaneously. The Cambrian explosion is one example of that. We just talked about that. But David Ropp, a paleontologist, said, instead of finding the gradual unfolding of life, what geologists of Darwin's time and geologists of the present day actually find is that species appear in the sequence suddenly, show little or no change during their existence in the record, and then abruptly go out of the record. Stephen Jay Gould, all paleontologists know that the fossil record contains precious little in the way of intermediate forms. Transitions between major groups are characteristically abrupt. And then you have recently Eugene Koonin, an information theorist, saying this: biological innovations happen abruptly in life's history without any trace of intermediate forms. And he identifies a number of instances where this pattern is observed, and he refers to them as basically biology's big bangs. That is, the history of life is more characterized by the sudden appearance of innovation. That to me looks like a signature for a creator. Now, what about the transitional forms in the fossil record? Well, people would point to things like these fissiopods. Have any of you heard of the fissiopods? Some of you might have. They're a commonly used example of evolution, where you have, according to the evolutionary model, these lungfish, lobed-finned fishes that gave rise to these intermediates between a fish and an amphibian, and that these intermediates are documenting an evolutionary transformation where fish made their way out of the water onto the land. And in the fossil record, you have these creatures that seem to be these intermediates between fish and amphibians, and they're dubbed fissiopods. Because an amphibian, another name for an amphibian, it would be a tetrapod. Tetra meaning four, pod meaning feet for a four-footed animal. But when you examine this transition, it's happening incredibly rapidly in a geological window of time, or geological instant, in a very narrow window of time. And what you see is not a sequence of fissiopods, but all of them co-occurring in the same layers. They're showing up simultaneously, so there's no sequence that we see. And by the way, things are out of order. You have more advanced ones appearing earlier and more primitive ones appearing later. Things are all jumbled up. And in fact, just recently, scientists discovered the footprints of an amphibian that were older than the fissiopods, meaning the fissiopods, which are transitional forms, were coming after the first appearance of tetrapods. This is called a temporal paradox, where the fossil record is backward from an evolutionary standpoint. So this just simply illustrates that when people claim they have these transitional forms, more often than not, when you examine the details, you see things that are troubling that don't match with what you would expect. And so when you look at these so-called fissiopods, what you could basically argue here is that there's no pattern of evolution in the fossil record, but rather that pattern is being forced on the data, because if you let the data give you the pattern, what you see is something other than a transitional pathway. It's just a mishmash of creatures that have a mosaic of features that are between a fish and an amphibian. But these creatures all lived at the water's edge, and to have that combination of features would actually make them ideally designed to live at the water's edge. And in fact, biologists call these mosaic designs. Well, think about this. When we design things as mosaics. A prime example would be a smartphone. I can remember, I still have an iPod Classic. That's old school. I only bought that like less than a decade ago, but that's how fast technology is developing. But it used to be you had a cell phone and you had an iPod, And then you might have had an internet device. Well, with a smartphone now, you've got all of those combined into one design. That's a mosaic design. And that's exactly what these creatures are. And they're ideally suited to live in a complex environment at the water's edge. So again, what people would argue is evidence for evolution could be readily understood as evidence for a creation model. In fact, this idea of transitional intermediate is actually an ambiguous term. It can mean two different things. It's like the term evolution. You got to pay attention to what is meant when that term is being used. Because you could see basically a transitional intermediate is either being part of a sequence going from A to B to C to D to E, where you would say these would be transitional intermediates. That's how I would think of it from an evolutionary standpoint. But when evolutionary biologists use this, they're saying a transitional intermediate is basically creatures between two time points in the geological record. And when you go back to the fissiopods, that's the definition that's actually being used, is that these are simply creatures between two time points in the fossil record. They're not creatures that form this sequence. And so you'll see creationists oftentimes say that there's no evidence for transitional intermediates in the fossil record. And what they mean is this, and indeed they're correct. But evolutionary biologists will say, no, you've got it wrong. We have all kinds of examples of transitional intermediates. And what they're doing is they're using this definition. So you have to be careful about how that term is being used. Be aware of that. Okay, I'm almost done. Thank you for hanging in there. We're going to wrap up very quickly. The last piece of evidence that people will cite for evolution is homology, shared biological features. And the classic example is the pentadactyl architecture of the forelimb. So we all, with our forearm, have two bones, the radius, the ulna. There are wrist bones, there are hand bones, there are finger bones. That's called a pentadactyl architecture. Penta means 5, dactyl means fingers or appendages. And presumably that design existed in the very first amphibians, the very first tetrapods. And from an evolutionary perspective, the argument is that that design was modified as evolutionary history proceeded, producing a variety of different biological systems that are all built around that design. So basically, a bat's wing, a whale's flipper, a horse's hoof, and on and on, and all have that same design. And that presumably reflects an evolutionary history. In fact, this idea is deeply intertwined with the theory of biological evolution, but it turns out that prior to Darwin, there was a scientist by the name of Richard Owen who actually argued that those shared features, those homologies, were actually an archetype that existed in the mind of a creator that was then functionally manifested in the created order. That he saw shared features as reflecting common design, not common descent. And I'm just going to go ahead and skip this just to bring things to a close. And so what Darwin did is he took Owen's idea of an archetype and he replaced it with a common ancestor. He replaced the concept that Owen had of this design existing in the mind of a creator, and Darwin said that that's a hypothetical common ancestor. But the point is that this evidence that is cited by many people as evidence for, again, evolution can make sense in a creation model framework. And in fact, when you look at the genetic similarity between humans and the great apes, you could see that similarity as reflecting our common design, not necessarily our common descent. And in fact, in that framework, you would expect humans and other animals to share biological features, anatomical, physiological, biochemical, and genetic features. That's a natural outworking of this idea. Okay, so to just kind of bring everything to a close, what we said tonight is that when it comes to thinking about the theory of evolution, it's both fact and fantasy. It's both reality and illusion. And what you have to do as a Christian is be able to distinguish which is which. And to do that, you need to pay attention to definitions, to how the word evolution is being used, even how the word transitional intermediate is being used. You also need to recognize the role that methodological naturalism plays in propping up the theory of evolution, and how this particular philosophical framework excludes any kind of explanation that involves a creator's handiwork when it comes to the origin, the history, and the design of life. And that because of this, evolution is assumed to be true whether or not the data supports it. And that there are scientific challenges to the theory of evolution. We talked about two of those. And then finally, the evidence that people point to as evidence for evolution, the fossil record and the shared biological features, can be made sense from a design framework. And if you understand these 4 points, you can go a long way towards not only thinking about how you can make sense of evolution as a Christian, or the claims that come from the evolutionary paradigm as a Christian, but I think you also are in a position to actually engage people who embrace this view and use this view as a way to justify their atheism, because you can show them that the theory of evolution doesn't invalidate the Christian faith, but rather, again, that evidence that is cited in support of evolution can actually be used to support a creation model view. Okay, well, I've gone on for long enough tonight. What I'll do is bring things to a close. I guess I'll invite you, Joel, up to the stage.